Final Fantasy 15 met with good critical praise and generally selling very well. Actually, it had very good sales. It's going to not lead into any sequels. Thank goodness. The director of the game, Hajime Tabata, sorry if I'm butchering that, this was in an interview with Polygon, said that a full sequel to Final Fantasy 15 doesn't make sense for what the studio wants to do with it. He said full sequel. Well, okay, let's. I'll talk about that in a little bit. What I think he may mean on that. He said if you do that full sequel model of expanding on an IP or a series, it's good in certain ways. The negative of that is there's a very large open period where you're not releasing anything. In that period, you get people to move away and their attachment to the franchise dissipates a little bit. Here's my deal with Final Fantasy sequels. They're never as good as the game that they're a sequel to. Final Fantasy X-2 should never have existed. I've heard people try to defend it. It's an indefensible game. It has no business existing. All right? 13-2 and Final Fantasy 13 Lightning Returns. There was nothing further to explore in that storyline. Unless you played 2, and 2 lands on a horrible cliffhanger, from what I've heard, leading up to the third game, which I don't even know if anyone played it. I don't know. Everyone ever... you played the third one?
Played the third one. I don't know why. I didn't buy the game. A friend of mine let me play it because he's like, wait, I think this might actually be good. And I was like, no.
All I know is I kept reading articles about that third game, and every time I read an article about it and they tried to explain something to do with time, and there's like missions that are time-based, it was just like, oh man, this sounds like a headache of a game to play. And I'm like, no, I'm good. I played Final Fantasy 13. I understand that 13-2 did away with some of the complaints that people had with the battle system of the first game. That does not warrant an entire sequel, though. It just doesn't. You know what you do? You make another game and you address the issues in your next game. That's what I've always loved about pre-Final Fantasy X-2. All the Final Fantasies have been self-contained. Like, you know, people even said that the Final Fantasy IV sequel that they made for, I think it was last gen, I think it was released on the Wii, not Virtual Console, but the Wii Shop channel or Wii, what were those games called that were just made for the Wii? But you know what I'm talking about. They were just titles released for the Wii, but digitally. People said that wasn't good either. And I'm talking about people who really liked the idea of Final Fantasy IV having a sequel. Didn't turn out good. And then they released it later on PSP as part of like the Final Fantasy IV Complete Edition or something like that. Final Fantasies are nice in that they pretty much always contain a self-contained story. You don't need to add to it. It's nice to, think about like, oh, well, I wonder what happens afterwards. I wonder where this goes. Yeah, that's fine, and you could do it in other things. You could pull an Advent Children and do a movie. You can do some sort of animated short. You could do a manga for all I care. You can do other things. I'm almost okay with you doing a game in a different genre, kind of like what they did with Dirge of Cerberus. Even though it didn't go over very well, I thought that was a neat idea for Final Fantasy VII. But it wasn't a sequel. It just was a game which took place 5 years after the original game, and it was a completely different genre, started a different character, and it just was different. So When he says a full sequel, I'm thinking he means like Final Fantasy X-2 or 13-2. I think what he means is now full sequel not being explored, things like Final Fantasy 12. Did you know that there was a sequel to 12 on the DS? I want to say it might have been called like Radiant Wings or Radiant. It was like Radiant something, but it was a sequel to 12 on the DS, and it kind of had like a, I wouldn't say chibi art style, but it did have like a more like an art style that fit the DS graphic capabilities. So, and I'm okay with that. I'm even okay with that. Like, I won't buy those. Some people will that really get into the stories, but you just don't need to do it, I think. What do you think?
I don't know. It seems like, well, for Final Fantasy 15, they kind of wrapped everything up. Just doesn't really seem like there's more to that story.
Mm-hmm. I think the reason why they did it for games like, well, no, okay, 10-2, I have no idea why they did it. None. I think maybe they did a sequel to 10 because 11 wasn't really a traditional Final Fantasy. It was strictly online. No single player at all. So they're like, well, let's do an 11 here by doing 10-2. And everyone was confused by the numbering. Then when it came to 13, they were like, oh my goodness, we spent all these years and all this money developing this white engine, luminous engine, crystal tools, whatever you want to call it, this very customized game engine. And they're like, oh my goodness, we can't just make one game with this engine. We got to make at least 2 more games to make back our money. I think that was the complete motivation for those sequels. Just they needed to recuperate their losses, which is a terrible reason to make a video game. Strictly to make back money. No, that's terrible. You're going to get lousy stuff, and that's what I think happened. I'm good with spin-offs. I am good with, things like Dissidia. Love Dissidia. Always think that's a good idea to do a mixture of these characters because these characters actually play really well of each other. But you don't need a sequel. Sometimes it's just nice to sit down, play a game with a good story, and the story is not to be continued. Sometimes that could be the most annoying thing to run into at the end of a game. To be continued.